We actually have a treat next, and it really is a good flow from a conversation about inclusive development because, and I don't know, anybody here watch a show called Game of Thrones? Anybody? Because I'm pretty sure, as an analogy, winter is coming. And I say that because we can talk as much as we want to talk about inclusive development, but there is an existential threat that relates to climate and relates to the ability of our neighborhoods, whether they're inclusively built or not, to be resilient enough to be around when the change that happens because of the new urbanist principles that we put in place in our plans, in our designs. And so I'm going to briefly introduce Doug Kelbaugh, who has written a book that talks about how to do what he calls the urban fix, and building resilient cities in the war against climate change, heat islands, and overpopulation. And we felt like this was a good sort of taking an even broader step back and going from what to a certain extent is the granular micro of inclusive development on the ground and saying what is another sort of macro set of things that we need to do. So Doug has 2 degrees from Princeton and is currently a professor at the University of Michigan. As the dean of Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning, he raised $45 million, he upgraded facilities, and actually founded the urban design program. He attended the first CNU in Alexandria. Was anybody else there at the first CNU? I see a couple of hands. And has only missed 2 annual congresses since then. He's delivered papers, been a panelist, and or a moderator at every single annual Congress that we've ever done. New urbanism is the second major movement in which he's played a significant role because he actually helped found the passive solar movement in the 1970s. By the way, Doug was a child prodigy. I just want to let you know. He's spoken at over 100 conferences in his 50-year career as an architect, urban designer, academic, and has well written or edited 6 books, a dozen book chapter, and scores of journal articles. So he's authored the book, The Urban Fix, which he's going to come talk about. And I believe there'll actually be a book signing after this session. So join me in giving a warm round of applause to Doug Kelbaugh.
Okay. Thank you, Calvin. So Lynn asked me to talk about gentrification, and I love Lynn. Don't we all love Lynn? Let's hear it for Lynn. So, gentrification is a chronic, age-old problem that's been growing worse throughout the world. Displacement, which is its nastiest impact, has gotten notoriously worse of late in developed and developing countries both. It's magnified by global economic trends such as increasing economic inequality and loss of traditional physical and social neighborhoods, as well as by climate change. This talk explores several strategies to help alleviate these negative impacts of gentrification, mainly in T3 and T4 neighborhoods. It doesn't really have time to go into the assimilation of climate refugees and other displaced people per se, which is really another talk. First, we need to recognize that cities are heating up twice as fast as their suburbs or their hinterlands and twice as fast as the planet as a whole. Look at Louisville. It's really heating up fast. Just about #1, actually. Americans are still the energy hogs of the planet, as Michael Dennis covered so cogently this morning. Well, here's the energy hog one. Both as a collective group and individually per capita were the worst. The last slide is obviously about density being leaner and greener. We always need to keep sprawl in mind. It's really what got us going as an organization. Because in addition to aggravating climate disruption, sprawl it actually contributes to a higher global population because people who live in the suburbs have higher birth rates. When they move to the cities, it drops. And if you add climate change and overpopulation together, it is a big-time disaster that's happening very quickly. Gentrification has plagued towns and cities since they became desirable and advantageous places to live some 5,000 years ago in a civilization that culminated in this very theater. This is about as good as it gets. With displacement of poorer residents because of high housing costs and property taxes, it's been a growing problem in too many cities. 7 cities accounted for nearly half of the gentrification nationally: New York, LA, Washington, Philly, Baltimore, San Diego, and Chicago. Washington was the most gentrified. We just heard about Washington by percentage of neighborhoods that experienced gentrification, although New York City was the most gentrified by sheer volume. Ever higher land costs in these and other cities make development of new or renovated affordable housing more and more difficult, especially as climate refugees migrate to cities, atop the rural residents who have been flocking to cities for many decades, really for centuries, in search of jobs and more personal freedom. As Jane Jacobs has pointed out, the reason that cities often become too expensive is simple arithmetic. Many people want to live in them, resulting in demand exceeding supply. And spatial and political hurdles make it difficult to further densify neighborhoods or build more of them. Urban infill and redevelopment is always politically charged, as we know, if not dead on arrival, and developed countries, especially in North America and Europe, are not building many new cities at all, which exacerbates gentrification. It's magnified by America's increasing inequality. Poverty concentration, which was discussed a bit, has been the most common type of demographic change over the last 2 decades. Local displacement trends include the rise of high-tech companies that pay very high salaries. The gentrifying dynamic also applies to retail and wholesale businesses, as I'm sure Maurice knows, and even local institutions. It's even worse. This doesn't seem quite right, but you can read this. It pretty well says it. 9 out of 10 new mortgages in this area are for whites. Gentrification just gets worse and worse. The global south, this is not the global south, but you get, I mean, a lot of poor neighborhoods like in Miami are on the higher ground. So as flooding becomes a bigger threat, they're getting moved out by gentrification. This is the global south. It is really unequal and sprawling at an unbelievable rate. Some people live 3 hours away from where they work with these onerous commutes that require multiple legs of transit. Ridiculously long commute times are also rising in the U.S. In a large continuing study of upward mobility, commuting time has emerged as the single strongest factor against the odds of escaping poverty. The longer an average commute, the worse the chances of low-income families moving up the ladder. The relationship between transportation and social mobility is stronger than crime, stronger than elementary school test scores, or the percentage of two-parent families in a community. It's a big deal, and CNU has worked hard on that. Overall, the bottom 10% of income earners has seen the steepest rise in costs since 1980, while the top 25% of earners actually see a decline in housing costs. They're paying less. Renters at all income levels are spending a greater share of their income than they did in 1980, but homeowners are actually paying a smaller fraction of their monthly paycheck. Despite gentrification's challenges, there are strategies that we know about, that we helped really found, to address well-known challenges. These are the challenges of high land prices, bureaucratic sluggishness, zoning codes, court battles, expensive financing, as well as lack of housing subsidies, of available land, of developers with sufficient wherewithal and patience to take on the lengthy, fraught process. There's also inertia with such a mashup of problems. It's best summed up in the unpopular, hapless term, density. Gentrification is not necessarily a zero-sum game. Not necessarily heads I win, tails you lose. In many gutted cities, it is better than no gentrification. We have to realize that in some cases, it's good. It helps. It's displacement that's the big misfortune. And otherwise, welcome new investment, welcome new commerce, welcome new jobs. Displacement must be addressed by aggressive policies, subsidies, and interventions, but we're living in this age of neoliberal politics, of the glorified market, and the availability of housing subsidies has been in decline, as we all know. Even in Europe, Northern Europe, the welfare countries. Never strong in the U.S., subsidies and assistance programs have been slowly gutted by the political groups who are suspicious of such government interventions in the market, or are elitist, or just downright racist. Pressed with new fiscal challenges, public subsidies are likely to continue to slide, exacerbated by the accumulating obsolescence of housing stock, the added expense of replacing fossil fuel energy with renewable systems, and more emergencies brought on directly or obliquely by climate change. Public-private partnerships, which are almost always more private money than public money, tax incentives and land trusts can help fill the gap. However, other changes are needed: more relaxed codes, better regulations, and smaller dwelling units, and more shared living arrangements, as we're seeing with the next generation. I'll focus on better transit and stronger neighborhoods, both of which will slow climate change and fight gentrification. Many environmentally focused urban designers want to repopulate urban neighborhoods, like many of us here, as a way to decrease carbon footprints. This, however, leads to several types of gentrification, depending on whether it's a wealthier or poorer city, larger or smaller. There's no single solution to housing affordability, just like there's no single antidote to climate change. Among possible strategies, increasing the number of walkable, bikeable, transit-friendly, mixed-use, cohesive neighborhoods, especially in larger cities. These attributes are often assembled in TODs. This term, arguably, which I think from my travels is known by every planner in every city on the planet, started out as pedestrian pocket, a term that my former partner Calthor, Peter, coined and we promoted in the pedestrian pocketbook after a 5-day charrette in 1988. The term quickly morphed into TOD and has spread quickly in the planning and development community. Thank you, CNU. It's really CNU who invented and promoted TOD. They really do reduce the carbon footprint of people who live there. Not just because they use more transit, walk more, bike more, but they tend to live in smaller dwelling units as well. Now, there's a limited supply of traditional or transit-served urban neighborhoods, as fully explored in Emily Talen's excellent new book, Neighborhood, which I recommend. She defines them as everyday neighborhoods. Physical places, quote, where built forms, identity, and social and economic worlds come together. The term neighborhood is not a bundle of data about class or race, but a physical place that can transcend the desire for social sameness or the fear of others and distrust of institutions. She proposes a number of ways to revive these traditional everyday neighborhoods. Emily points out that only 18% of neighborhoods that were considered economically integrated in 1970 remain integrated in the year 2000. 18%. There's also a question of whether gentrification is fundamental to capitalism, which, let's face it, is in more and more trouble, more and more hot water here and abroad on all the questions of and dimensions of inequity. Creating, I think for the first time, we can start to really question the fundamentals of capitalism openly and publicly, which is not true at the first CNU. Creating a dense, walkable neighborhood almost always means increasing the density of an existing built environment that has often been developed around the automobile. Infill development typically arouses NIMBYism, which fears more traffic and cars to park, as well as taller shadow-casting buildings. In other cases, it's a fear of an unwelcome change in demographics, the influx of a diverse, low-income group of residents, a decline in neighborhood character, real estate values, etc. So you've heard a lot about TOD. What about DOT? It's an interesting new twist, which I call development-oriented transit. It describes inserting or enhancing transit within existing metro areas, knitting it carefully into the fabric that's already there. This often means taming arterial strips, a nationwide need that can be addressed with 3 increasingly recognized strategies, thanks to CNU. Make them more walkable, bikeable, and human-scaled. In suburbia, decrease their forbidding width, the actual right-of-way, by adding median strips and splitting them into one-way couplets and even building buildings in between, as Michael Dennis showed earlier. These streets are much easier for, obviously couplets, narrow streets are much easier for pedestrians to cross. They're more human-scaled, et cetera, well, you know the story on that. And they don't have the towering signs you see at interchanges. They're small signs hanging from building facades, which are continuous street walls. That's 1. 2, develop dense nodes at distances conducive to light rail transit, typically every mile or 2. Express buses, a la Curitiba's famous BRT system, or ART, automated rapid transit, can have even more frequent stops. Such development is either new TOD or more likely DOT. These nodes need to be sufficiently dense and mixed use to offer a wide range of uses, all the usual things. But every node can't have it all, but every node does need housing and commerce. You need retail and housing. Taller buildings with more iconic architecture are a good way, of course, to visually mark these nodes. 3, in linear development, there should be major exceptions, such as existing towns, small cities, regional parks, large high schools, university campus or research campus, an office or hospital complex. These need to sort of punctuate the smaller nodes. And the linear city need not be in a straight line. It can bend to connect these existing nodes or curve around natural features. So Calthorpe, who can't be here, has recently proposed plans for El Camino Real, which somebody mentioned. This is a 43-mile section of Silicon Valley, which has a big housing crisis. Can you imagine adding 500,000 jobs and only about 70,000 dwelling units? This is a recipe for disaster. Within a half-mile of this corridor, there are more than 2,000 acres of relatively low-intensity commercial development and thousands of office jobs. The transit corridor will have dense nodes at stations that are typically spaced about 2 miles apart along the existing Caltran commuter line. The project is also meant to lower home prices dramatically in some cases. In addition, a new enhanced BRT line will run its length using autonomous vans in dedicated lanes, ART. Such a system will provide faster service and is cheaper to build than typical bus or rail transit. As you see on the right, and travel speeds get better. It's a win-win. The proposal replaces only low-rise commercial buildings with this 4- and 5-story mixed-use fabric, avoiding demolition of more substantial structures by building in the large parking lots, of which there are many. The proposed linear city is connected by the larger Bay Area or BART system and Caltran and light rail and now or soon to be automated rapid transit. So what's this got to do with climate change? A lot. That's the area of the bay that's likely to flood. And you see, it's a little hard in red, areas that are very prone to wildfire. This is pinched in between two big natural forces that are only going to be exacerbated by climate change. He used his urban footprint, which is represented over at our hotel, to analyze 3 different scenarios. This is scenario 3. They vary in the number of parcels and land area, ranging from about 2,000 commercial parcels in Caltran, parcels in one option to 3,750 for the art option. This is the densest. This is scenario 3. It would add about 250,000 housing units. It's a lot of housing units. The scheme would increase ridership by 130%, only 60% of the with a system that has only 60% of the operating and maintenance costs when compared to bus rapid transit on the corridor. Construction costs are less. Operating costs are less, and ridership goes up. The environmental benefits abound. Residents would drive 1/3 fewer miles per year. That's like taking 93,000 cars off the road. 45% less greenhouse gas would be emitted. That's the equivalent of about 108,000 Bay Area households. I think when this is completed, and I'm hopeful, although maybe Dan and others from the Bay Area have a better sense of that, it will really be a model for many other cities to emulate. Participatory displacement, a term my editor came up with. It's accepted among urban planners that dense walkable areas can be buzzy, vibrant, diverse, and multicultural. We all agree about that. It's also known that the simple fear of change and difference often goes beyond NIMBYs to more extreme bananas. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. It is bananas should be replaced by Quimbys, as the late, great Hank Dittmar promoted. It's ironic that advocacy planning, a movement which my generation started in the 1960s, even as students, we were very active in the birth of that movement. It started this trend of public input and community meetings that now is just a standard expectation. People don't realize it was a hard-fought battle to have public community meetings. So public participation is still intact, but it's been slowly replaced, in my opinion, by citizens' zeal to preserve and protect their neighborhoods, especially a loss in homogeneity or real estate values. It's become more selfish. As public input has become standard operating procedure, it has often really devolved into blatant self-interested obstructionism. Whatever the motive, it has become the ongoing scourge, if not the undoing, of real estate developers. So it's subtle in a way, but it's pretty blatant in other ways, gentrification. So a little more density. Density means upzoning for greater height and greater bulk, encouraging duplexes, triplexes, mid and high-rise apartments, condominium buildings, and formerly single-family areas. It can mean adding shops on the ground floors, as well as live-work units that allow people to live above, behind, next to their workspace or their retail space, yielding the zero commute, which is an admirable goal. It can mean allowing an ADU, backyard cottage, mother-in-law suite, or carriage house, either attached, detached, or along a back alley above garages. They're very popular in Vancouver, Canada. They're roughly of all the homes in Vancouver, a third, this is single-family homes, a third of them, about 26,000 houses, have added an ADU on their property. Roughly 500,000 backyards in LA could be put to this same use without changing neighborhood character. After legal barriers were removed in 2017, the number of permits for backyard ADUs increased 1,800% in 1 year. These relatively inexpensive units are meaningful in LA, particularly because homelessness is growing there, and nearly a third of its residents spend more than half their income on rent. A recent Chicago study demonstrates that upzoning is no panacea. It can increase housing supply over the long run, but to succeed, it must be applied to a very large area so there's competitive housing, a market that's truly competitive with lots of development capacity. Strategies should include upzoning and reduced parking requirements, appropriate inclusivity, as talked about in the previous panel, affordable units in market rate buildings, affordable housing built on public land, in close-in neighborhoods, public subsidies for housing, and reduced approval requirements and fees for moderately priced infill housing. Extending transit to new areas that include dense nodal developments is less problematic than inserting it in existing fabric, as in DOTs. Because right-of-ways tend to be too narrow or too steep or too curvy. Greenfield TODs, which we started doing long ago in this group, are easier to develop than a DOT. In spite of the challenges, there are now nonetheless countless examples of successful densification of existing suburbs, including the retrofitting of grayfield malls, office parks, subdivisions, as documented by fellow new urbanists Ellen Dunham Jones and June Williamson in their book, Retrofitting Suburbia, which is still selling. Detroit. Well, this is, I don't know if this is an image from their book or not, but it certainly covers their points. This is some infill around the Amtrak station in Detroit in a studio that Maurice was involved in at the University of Michigan. So, working on inclusivity. Only 20% of U.S. families that are poor enough to qualify for a housing subsidy actually receive one. 1 in 5 who are qualified for a subsidy actually get it. A quarter of all renters pay more than half their income in rent. In LA, it's a third. And as you know, the off-recommended standard is 1/3. These families are forced to make painful choices between rent, food, doctor's visits, education. It's not pretty. The poor have been pushed further from the economic opportunities of city centers to locations where jobs and public transit are sparse. Sprawl threatens society's ability to nurture growing mixed-income, sustainable cities. Ever higher land costs make development of affordable housing ever more difficult. Without government subsidies, affordable housing is too often infeasible. Over-focusing on the wealthy cores of cities, with their often empty luxury towers, can stoke this inequity and at the same time make the urban cores more monocultural. A relatively new kind of homesteading in New York City is happening, shows some promise of helping to crack this hard nut. They're called community land trusts, CLTs. They're a model of collective ownership of housing on community-owned land designed to encourage long-term stability and foster neighborhood self-determination. They develop property through community-run organizations, sometimes along with the local government and the private sector, but without conventional bank financing or government funding. They're not really subsidized. Another technique is to soften local gentrification with community investment trusts, not community land trusts. This is being tested now in East Portland, Oregon. It offers local renters and owners very low-cost bonds, which actually yield, they have a yield for the buyer that grows with local investment. They actually help own the neighborhood. Central cities have exacerbated gentrification because of extreme heat in cities. We all know the term urban heat island. It can be a major factor in people's decision to move or stay in cities. We want them to stay in cities for lots of reasons, not only a smaller carbon footprint, energy footprint, eco footprint, but also lower birth rate. But heat can be a major factor in whether they move to or stay in a city. Other environmental issues bedevil cities. A Bronx neighborhood that wanted to clean up former brownfield sites and add new parks was worried about gentrification. They were worried about attracting gentrifiers and speculative condo developers. Their strategy, later dubbed just green enough, was to do small-scale scattered improvements determined by the very residents that wouldn't raise housing costs too much. They were very careful about it. In reviving cities like Detroit, as discussed by Maurice and others, gentrification will only serve to ensure that lower income, middle income, and upper income people will continue to live in separate, unequal neighborhoods, making social and economic conditions in poor urban neighborhoods even worse. I do write about that a bit in the Urban Fix. Importantly, if there is physical space, there's a quote about Detroit, how a lot of our graduates and others are moving there. They used to laugh when I suggested they move to Detroit, or smirk or giggle or whatever. Now they can't wait to move there. But it is an issue, as Maurice mentioned, only 10% white. It's an African-American city. and also a lot of Latinos. But there are people being attracted that are now gentrifying. Whether poor people leave their homes by choice or by conviction, are we running out of time? No. Whether poor people leave their homes by choice or eviction, the process might better be called replacement rather than displacement. A study by Chicago sociologists found that neighborhoods that were more than, well, that's too much detail. There are many examples of displacement and replacement in cities we call legacy cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and St. Louis, as well as shrinking cities in Europe. Lean urbanism, that sweet spot between new urbanism and tactical urbanism, can help. It can provide affordable new housing with below median income levels without any subsidy at all or very little. Bonuses for taller buildings can require affordable housing be included. Local governments must do their share too, with increases in allowable densities, especially around transit stops. The time has come for municipalities to resist neighborhood resistance, NIMBYism, bananas. Local government needs to be more proactive, including pink zones. Maurice has a different name, I can't remember what it is, but these are higher density with ADUs, John Anderson's walk-ups. I haven't seen John, I hope he comes. So, to end slowly here, as the costs of suburbia continue to mount and become better known, the appeal of the city will keep growing. It's going to get worse, particularly for young professionals and empty nesters. Upzoning, retrofitting, shared work and shared living space, WeWork, etc., will continue to flourish and ADUs will spread. Young adults who grew up, like us, in their parents' suburbs will find many new and creative ways to populate cities. And elderly people, age 65 and older, are already in love with cities, urbanity. 80% of this cohort now lives in metro areas. They love the good health systems, continued learning opportunities, public transportation, arts, glam, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. They particularly appeal to younger professionals and empty nesters. So what do we as planners need to do? There are at least 3 ways for cities to deal with neighborhood gentrification. First, older subsidized housing projects in or near reviving areas should be maintained and preserved. Second, municipal ordinances that require owners to give advance notification of their intent to sell or convert their properties might even give the right of first refusal to existing tenants. Third, require developers to concurrently build affordable units within their new projects or to set aside land or buildings for future affordable housing. We do that in Ann Arbor, and we have a big housing fund. These techniques may require a mix of regulations, incentives, low-interest financing, tax credits, and these community investment trusts. Nonetheless, to actually conclude, gentrification will continue to haunt successful cities the world over, as it always has. The supply of good urbanism, which we foster and fight for, will tend to be inadequate. Not the urbanism, but the supply of it, as people want, even scramble to move to desirable urban neighborhoods. The market cannot and will not be able to solve the problem by itself, especially as global climate change and heat islands increase the number of climate refugees. We need interventions, subsidies, laws, regulations, and more. Like all social, political, economic challenges that we've seen during our life, it will take the patient and diligent vigilance of the citizenry and their leaders. We can do it with strategies like TOD, DOT, and reviving traditional neighborhoods. Go for it. And let's have a little bourbon and books. Thank you.